Ahoy! When I started off playing Deadlock, I played a lot with my friends to get used to the game, and many of them are primarily shooter players. I, on the other hand, am much more of a MOBA player with almost 20 years of MOBA experience at this point. And recently I got asked what advice I have for shooter players that are new to MOBAs, what mistakes they typically made and how to improve that. Let's talk about that, starting with the laning phase. Now, most shooter players, because they have good aim, are able to play relatively aggressive while laning. And that is sometimes a bit of a problem because it doesn't necessarily always teach them the best habits. If in your first couple of games you can run over your competition in lane and just farm their dead body, then you may not really learn how to properly farm. Resulting from that, I see many shooter players focus too much on poking the enemy or trying to go for kills, and not enough on clearing the waves, securing souls and denying souls for the enemy. Now don't get me wrong, putting pressure on the enemy laner and forcing them away to make it easier for you to deny and secure souls or to set up a kill opportunity later is definitely a good idea. It just shouldn't be the only thing you're doing. You should always be mindful of your farm first, and then poke should be the secondary priority to that. By extension, a lot of shooter players also seem to forget that they have a melee attack. This is not only useful in fights against other players, but also to secure lane minions without risking any of the farm getting denied. If you're able to reliably put pressure on the enemy, then there should be a lot of windows for you to melee minions in between. When playing a duo lane, also keep in mind that doesn't give you a free pass to suddenly just focus on enemy players, because whoever you're playing on that duo lane with may not always have access to all minions, not be able to position in a way to clear out all the minions for you. And also, if you're the shooter player with good aim, then it makes a lot more sense for you to also try and secure a lot of the orbs, because you do that a lot easier because you have the skill to do so. What I've also seen frequently from shooter players is them leaving lane for a gank on another lane, which is a good thing in itself. That is something that can be very beneficial in early game, but then often they have a tendency to not come back and kind of just transition into a fighting across all lane stage very, very early, which then means their duo partner will have to fend for themselves. That can often mean giving up an early lead because obviously a 2v1 lane is gonna be pressured significantly. Shooter players tend to have a higher tendency to do risky dives and not respect the Guardian early on. We see the opposite with MOBA players who respect the Guardian way too much because in other games that first tower is an absolute menace, but there's probably a middle ground somewhere where you can respect the Guardian's damage and not dive in deep when you don't even have minions nearby that can hold some of the fire for you, but on the other hand also don't play too passive and utilize the parry to avoid some of the damage from the Guardian. On the item side, I see shooter players often focus very heavily on aggressive items and also often on more expensive than they need to be early game items, not really prioritizing tier 1 items but rather just going for some yellow tier 2s, tier 3s right away because they have a big number and they sound good. Most tier 1 items have strong effects and also give you a pretty significant weapon damage increase for a cheap price, so generally I would say they are advisable to some degree. You shouldn't rush too many, but you also shouldn't ignore them. I've made a full breakdown of the tier 1 weapon damage as well as spirit damage items. If you're interested in that, I will link that here. Also, if you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. It really helps me out, especially in a new game like Deadlock. On the topic of items, I also see shooter players often skipping sustain and defensive items entirely early on and just going for as much damage as possible. There are some really strong mobility items in the green category if you don't care about anything else there, so at least those should be considered. And similarly, for example, bullet lifesteal is extremely strong. Transitioning into mid-game, I have another note on items, and that is a lack of counter building. Now, this isn't exclusively a shooter player thing, but MOBA players tend to have more of a tendency to go for counter building because they're already somewhat more used to it, but of course everyone needs to learn the item first and that's a big part of it. But quickly pressing tab to see what kind of damage the strongest players on the enemy team are dealing isn't that difficult, and buying bullet or spirit armor isn't that difficult either. You can figure out the more advanced aspects as you go. I also have a full counter item build video soon. The next mistake is fairly universal, but of course if you're coming from MOBAs you're going to be a bit more used to this. That's neglecting jungle farm as well as crates and statues in Deadlock in particular as well. Farming jungle creeps is insanely impactful on your overall soul farm, and especially easy if you're already playing a more DPS focused character, a gun focused character, because most of them have very nice means of quickly clearing an entire camp, especially if you're using Tesla bullets or Ricochet. You don't need to exclusively jungle, but you should take opportunities when they arise. And that brings us to the next mistake, which is only looking for team fights and not for farm or pressure in between. A lot of shooter players that came over from other games tend to treat Deadlock a bit like Overwatch, where you're just basically in a constant team fight, which is very understandable because it's very fun. But in terms of efficiency, that only works as long as your team is snowballing, which won't always be the case. What I typically find is that shooter players will primarily rotate for picks or just to join a group fight, a bit of a death ball. Instead, rotations should be focused on the objectives. Maybe there is a player in a lane that can be killed, and then following from that you can push up a walker. That would be very beneficial. Or you can rotate towards a player, but there are also multiple uncleared jungle camps nearby. Again, very beneficial. Even if you don't get the kill, you will be able to get some pressure on that lane and you can farm the jungle camps. Too often the focus seems to be on getting the highest damage and the highest kills over anything else, but that doesn't matter that much if the enemy team is just farming more effectively and they're not really losing many objectives following their death. In a game where a single dynamo ult can turn the entire outcome around, you wanna be focusing on building off your lead, getting structures after kills, getting objectives, so that whenever you get more of a lead, it's more impactful on the overall outcome of the game as well. And if you lose the pressure for a while, then it's also completely fine to play passive and fall back and farm, rather than looking for engages over and over. Shooter players often try to trade against people with a significant souls advantage. This is understandable because usually they are in a position of having a souls advantage, and often their aim can offset any souls that they're behind in, but there is a point where that's just no longer feasible. But that doesn't mean the game is lost in that moment, you just need to play passive for a little bit. The next mistake is a bit more specific because it depends on which game you're coming from. But generally I see quite a few shooter players not pay enough attention to the minimap, probably mostly because they are from a game that doesn't have a minimap. This also matters in early game, but in my opinion becomes particularly relevant around mid-game. That includes both trying to get vision of the enemy as well as getting pings from your teammates. One thing I do see some shooter players get right is that sometimes they'll go out of their way to split push, primarily because they want to look for 1v1s at the towers and at the walkers, but either way the outcome's the same. But then they forget about player vision and awareness in general, and don't really pay attention to what's going on around them on the minimap. And coming back to the topic of objective play and melee attacking briefly, I also see shooter players try and secure the Rejuvenator after killing the mid-boss way less often, which is the whole reason you're killing that thing, so you should really be doing that, or at least be using some zoning tools to make sure the enemies can't. In late game, I mainly see two mistakes. The first one is not aggressively pushing or shoving waves. As usual, the issue here is being too focused on killing other players, but pushing up minion waves, even though they're not that tanky in late game, has a massive impact on the overall pressure that you have across the map and how many objectives you can go for as well. If someone on your team needs to constantly go back to hold off minion waves, you're effectively playing a 5v6. And then of course we have farming kills in base instead of going for the patron. This makes a lot of sense, it's very tempting because it's very fun to farm other players, but realistically you should probably focus your attention on the patron so that you can actually win the game. It takes a whole lot longer if your Lash or Dynamo is the only one shooting that thing. If you're interested in more Deadlock tips and tricks of all sorts, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified of upcoming videos. The next days we'll have some more advanced tips. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.